Hello and welcome to lecture 36 in Ancient and Medieval Worlds. This lecture is divided into two parts and is about the rise of the Ottoman Empire, but it also has a very fun side bit in part two on the history of the real historical figure Vlad Tepes behind the fictional Dracula. And this is one of my favorite lectures because of that. I'm fascinated by the Ottomans in general, but I find the historical circumstances around Dracula, which unfortunately we can't get into depth on here, absolutely fascinating. So this is really going to set a lot of the stage for the 1400s and going into the 1500s, which is really where our course comes to an end. But the conquest of Constantinople, its transition from a Byzantine Christian power into an Islamic Ottoman power, is one of the major changes that signifies the transition from the medieval to the early modern period. The rise of the Ottoman Empire, therefore, signals a profound change in world history. The Ottomans, who are a dynasty that ruled over the Turks in Anatolia, unified a significant portion of the Muslim world and began a new age of conquest not seen since the earliest days of the Muslim Caliphate back in the 600s. Not only that, but they finally accomplished the goal of Muslim rulers since the dawn of Islam, the conquest of Byzantine Constantinople, now renamed Istanbul, which once again became the center of a major world empire, but this time of an expanding Muslim superstate that stretched well into Europe and terrified Christians. Today, we remember the weak, decaying Ottomans of the 1800s, whose fall in World War I fragmented the Middle East, creating all the chaos and war that have become synonymous with that region today. But before that, for more than 300 years, the Ottomans held together a vibrant, thriving state that was in many ways more impressive than any other on the planet. It was this powerful Ottoman state that Western Europeans feared above all others, and which forced them to find a new way to the rich trade of Eastern Asia, with the accidental consequence of discovering the Americas. Now, the Ottomans began their rise to power by expanding into Europe from Asian Anatolia, changing the dynamic of crusading from offensive reclaiming of the Holy Land that we've looked at earlier in this class to defensively trying and ultimately failing to prevent Islamic expansion at the expense of Christian territory into Europe itself. So the Crusades, what we're going to see here is a transition from crusading as an offensive endeavor where Christians attempt to conquer Muslim territory to a defensive endeavor where Christians attempt to prevent Muslim conquests of Christian territory. The story begins in Turkey, which, as we saw just a few lectures ago, had solidly transitioned not only to a religiously Muslim land by the 1300s, but also an ethnically Turkish one. Remember, Islam does not equal Arab. You may remember that the Seljuks of Rum had been broken by the Mongols, resulting in a bunch of competing Turkish states. The one that would come to dominate was the Ottoman dynasty. The advantage of the Ottomans was that their territory was on the extreme north and west of the Anatolian Peninsula, hard against the borders of what remained of the Byzantine Empire, which by this point was mostly just Constantinople, and facing west towards Greece, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe. And this meant that the Ottomans had someone to fight who wasn't Muslim. They could claim that they were fulfilling their duty as pious Muslims to fight the enemies of Islam. And that turned out to be a very powerful bit of rhetoric on their side, just as we have seen it was for Saladin in his efforts to reclaim Jerusalem. Use that kind of religious rhetoric, that fight the foe of Islam rhetoric, to unify Muslims against the Crusaders, and then later on how the Mamluks justified their new regime because they had defeated the Mongols and finally ended the Crusades. The Ottomans are tapping into that same kind of us versus them dynamic. It also didn't hurt that the Byzantines were really easy marks. The Ottomans gobbled up the last of the major Byzantine cities in Anatolia, now Turkey, in the 1330s. But more disastrously, one Byzantine claimant to the throne in Constantinople, who had actually married his daughter to the leader of the Ottomans, invited the Ottoman Turks into Europe to help him secure the throne just before the Black Death arrived around 1350. Before that, The Ottomans, who at this early point really didn't have any kind of naval power at all. The Turks did not have a long history of naval power. They were, of course, horse nomads from Central Asia, had not been able to make the crossing into Europe, but they were actually brought into Europe by Byzantines themselves as part of internal politics in Constantinople. This is a problem that we've seen going all the way back, of course, to the Fourth Crusade. Inviting someone to help win your own internal power struggle often leads to disaster, and this was no exception. Once they were in Europe, the Ottomans could not be forced out, and they quickly colonized the region just beyond Constantinople in northern Greece, thus surrounding the capital of the Byzantine Empire on both sides. The Ottomans could not yet take the city of Constantinople, as its fortifications were still too strong at this point, and it controlled enough territory in southern Greece to support itself with its still relatively impressive navy. But the Ottomans quickly moved their capital to their European possessions in the 1360s, and that really signaled Ottoman desire to expand further into Europe. And that's where Ottoman conquests really begin, not at the expense of other Muslim states. That will come later, but at the expense of Christian states, and that enticed many other Muslims to come and help fight on the behalf of the Ottomans. The Ottomans progressively conquered more and more territory in Europe in the 1300s, raiding the Balkan Peninsula south of the Danube River. But their fleets, which they were beginning to build at this point, also committed acts of piracy in the Mediterranean against both Christian and rival Muslim traders. One example of this, their opponents were, as we've seen earlier, the kings of Cyprus, who were also claiming the title of King of Jerusalem, even though they didn't control the city of Jerusalem anymore. Then these kings of Cyprus, as we saw, had organized naval leagues with the Venetians and the Byzantines, backed by the popes and even the kings of France, and they won some minor naval victories against these Turkish pirates in the 1330s. That's really the beginning of the shift from offensive to defensive crusading. These actions really have no intention of retaking the Holy Land. They're entirely attempting to protect that trade between actually Christians and Muslims that we looked at when we talked about the economy of the later Middle Ages. And we saw that this shift was solidified by the disastrous attempt of the king of Cyprus to take Alexandria in Egypt in the 1360s in the Alexandrian Crusade, the last crusade that actually attempted to attack Muslim territory in the Middle East. Now, the Venetians were more than happy to fight the Ottoman pirates, threatening the ports and islands of their maritime empire in Greece, but they were not interested, again, as we saw in a previous lecture, in attacking their Mamluk trading partners. Ottoman Turkish pirates threatened trade between the Venetians and the Mamluks. This was never, therefore, as simple as Muslims versus Christians. Now, these naval leagues were by and large fairly successful at containing the Ottomans by sea, but they were far more effective at conquering by land. In 1389, the Ottomans met a combined force of the various Christian Slavic kingdoms of the region at the Battle of Kosovo. And despite horrendous casualties on both sides, the Ottomans decisively defeated their Slavic and other Orthodox Christian opponents, allowing them to claim most of the Balkan Peninsula in the aftermath. After the Battle of Kosovo, the King of Hungary, who was by far the most powerful Christian king in the region, became extremely worried about the growing Ottoman threat. They were no longer a problem just for the Greeks and Slavs, but a danger to all of Central Europe. The King of Hungary called for a crusade to stop the raiding and territorial advance of the Ottomans, much as the Naval League earlier in the century had contained Turkish piracy. Again, this shows a major shift to defensive crusading, no longer with the goal of retaking Jerusalem, but just with stopping this aggressive new Muslim expansion into Christian territory. Now, today, we call this the Crusade of Nicopolis, because that fortress on the Danube is where the one major battle of the crusade was fought in 1396. Nicopolis was the last time a major contingent of Western Christian Europeans would work together on a grand scale under the ideal of crusading. After this, the French no longer mobilized en masse to go east, although individuals might go. Notably, the King of France was absent at Nicopolis, but perhaps as many as 10,000 Frenchmen went east in an attempt to stop the Ottoman Turks and fought alongside the Hungarians, Romanians, and various other Slavic peoples. So the French nobles, along with, it should be said, many Germans, allied with these Hungarians and other Eastern European peoples, Poles, Bulgarians, Romanians, and again more on the Romanians in a minute when we talk about Dracula, to confront the Ottoman army at Nicopolis on the Danube. It was a disastrous defeat, however, for the European Crusaders, largely to be blamed on the French, who apparently got overly excited about the whole crusading ideal and charged when they should have held back. A complete success for the Ottomans, however, ultimately broke the ideal of crusading. This disaster at Nicopolis ended further enthusiasm for a united effort by Western Europeans to fend off the advances of the Ottomans. From now on, Eastern Europe was on its own, though the West might make a token show of support. But really, to my mind, this is the end of the real Crusades, with the Crusade of Nicopolis. The Ottomans consolidated their hold over the Balkans south of the Danube, with Constantinople as the only major Christian holdout, now surrounded on all sides by Ottoman territory. In 1453, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmet II besieged Constantinople with an enormous army of 50 to 80,000 men, including many Christians sent by his vassal states in Eastern Europe, cowed after the Crusade of Nicopolis and other Ottoman victories into working for the Ottomans. This dwarfed the 8,000 or so defenders, and it may possibly have actually outnumbered the total population of the city of Constantinople, a city that had once housed over 1 million people and was now only a shadow of its former glory. More important than numbers, though, was that Mehmet had brought cannons to the battle. These were a brand new development in the mid-1400s. They were already beginning to change how warfare operated all across Europe. They were, for instance, very crucial in the final battles between France and England in the 100 Years' War in the 1450s. They were fundamentally changing how siege warfare operated in the medieval period. Before this time period, castles and massive fortifications for cities were the norm, and a city or a castle could hold out for months waiting for reinforcements to come save it. Constantinople's walls, that had been built a millennium earlier during Roman times, were designed for this kind of ancient siege warfare. They were tall and thin. They were designed to keep out cavalry and infantry. They could withstand catapults, but not cannonballs. Mehmet had actually hired a Hungarian cannon maker to build enormous guns, almost 30 feet long, to bombard the walls. After months of siege and bombardment, he finally captured the now ruined city of Constantinople. Now, the loss of Constantinople was devastating for Christian Europe, psychologically and strategically, but an equally enormous triumph for the Ottomans. Europeans were now shut off not only from direct trade east that they had had with Outremer, right, going all the way back to the Crusades, one of the things that had really reignited the European economy by connecting it with the wider global economy. But now, even the less popular Silk Road via Constantinople through the Black Sea was lost. Between the Mamluks and the Ottoman Muslims, all routes east further into Asia, including India and China, the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia, all of these were now controlled. All of the routes to these places were now controlled by Muslims, adding even more impetus to the goal of finding another way around, as we shall see in our next few lectures. Mehmet, on the other hand, now a great hero of Islam, and has forever after been known as Mehmet the Conqueror. The Ottoman Empire itself went from being from being a relatively minor player on the outskirts of Islam, one that was expanding Islam but wasn't seen as a major player, to being the great power of Islam, because they had finally achieved the dream of every great Muslim leader since the first expansion of the faith back in the 600s. This victories made the Ottomans world famous, and the success of the Ottomans led to several important population migrations. Despite general hostility to Western Christians, thousands of Greeks fled the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, both before and after 1453, and moved to Western Europe, especially Italy. These refugees brought with them Greek learning and classical texts, as well as artistic styles and knowledge that we shall see in our next lecture contributed enormously to the Renaissance, although they didn't begin it. To replace these populations, and the general decline of both Constantinople and the region around it that had been ongoing for the past several hundred years since the Fourth Crusade, Mehmet invited in the growing refugee population of Muslims and Jews from Spain. Although the final expulsion of these peoples did not happen until 1492, many already saw the writing on the wall. Spanish intolerance was Ottoman gain, as many of these people were highly skilled. Other peoples from across the Ottoman Empire were either enticed or forced to come repopulate the devastated city of Constantinople, and by the early 1500s it was the largest city in Europe once again. This restored and expanded the cosmopolitan character of Constantinople and helped restore it to greatness. The Ottomans lavished their wealth and resources on their new capital, increasingly coming to call it Istanbul, rebuilding it as a cosmopolitan Muslim city on par with the great Islamic cities of old like Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo. So, in this first part of the lecture, we've looked at the Ottomans up to from their origins as just one minor Turkish state amongst many on the peninsula, through their various conquests in the Balkans, to their ultimate achievement of taking Constantinople and establishing themselves as one of the dominant players in the Muslim world. In the second half of this lecture, we're going to look at a relatively minor figure that was part of this whole equation, Dracula, the prince or voivode of one of the three parts of Romania. And then afterwards we will look at the final conquests of the Ottomans that saw them become perhaps the greatest kingdom in the world.